After almost 4 years of delays, the most anticipated white-collar trial in years is finally getting underway. The criminal fraud case against Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, this is the big one we've all been waiting for. It's all about Elizabeth Holmes. She wanted to be the next Steve Jobs, and for a while she managed to con everyone. She claimed to have invented an amazing blood testing machine that was going to revolutionize the world of medicine. She quickly became the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. But then, thanks to some brave whistleblowers and a dogged journalist, the whole facade came crashing down. She lost her fortune and is about to go on trial for wire fraud. Now, if found guilty, she faces 20 years in prison. We'll look at the trial in a moment, but first, this quick look at the rise and fall of Elizabeth Holmes.
This is a revolutionary company that threatens to change healthcare the same way that Amazon changed retail, or Intel and Microsoft changed computing, or Apple, yes, changed the cell phone.
The right to protect the health and well-being of every person is a basic human right.
A healthcare pioneer is being compared to visionaries like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs.
Elizabeth Holmes, she's the founder and CEO of Theranos, a revolutionary diagnostics company.
Her mission is to allow blood testing in every drugstore at a fraction of Medicare costs.
The company says it can run up to 40 different tests on a tiny sample of blood.
Upending the existing paradigm that's costly, inefficient, and painful for the client, namely you.
Her innovation has fueled anticipation in the healthcare industry.
She has become wildly popular among those of us who follow things like this.
She is the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world.
Whenever there is a quote-unquote glass ceiling, there's an iron woman right behind it.
You founded this company 12 years ago, right? Tell them how old you were.
I was 19. People are going to challenge you, they're going to fight you, they're going to try to destroy you, they're going to do all this stuff. When you love it so much, you want to keep fighting for it.
A federal inspection report finds health startup Theranos ran blood tests during a 6-month period despite erratic quality control results.
That's where the story of Theranos starts to crumble.
It never worked, and there was a series of deceptive actions that were taking place.
All these people had invested, like Betsy DeVos, I think it was, and this company. It was bullshit.
And almost every media outlet, including us here at CBS, bought into the Theranos myth.
Even when the articles started coming out, people kind of didn't want to believe. They had George Shultz on the board.
How could this con artist convince so many brilliant people?
Forbes magazine has downgraded the net worth of Elizabeth Holmes from $4.5 billion to nothing.
A high-flying CEO now facing prison time, accused of masterminding a billion-dollar fraud.
Elizabeth Holmes has fallen into FBI's hands tonight.
This feels like the end of this story for a company that I think a lot of people once thought was going to change medicine.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. And Joseph Fuiz is a medical inventor and a former neighbor of Elizabeth Holmes. Doug Burns is a white-collar defense lawyer and former federal prosecutor who's been following this case closely. And finally, Hirsch Sheffrin is an economist at Santa Clara University specializing in behavioral finance, the psychology of the financial decisions we all make, really, investing and so on. Welcome to all of you. Doug, I'd like to start with you and the trial itself. She's accused of wire fraud. Could you just tell us, for our viewers' sake, what is wire fraud and why on earth does it carry a sentence of potentially 20 years in prison?
Yes, wire fraud is mail fraud and wire fraud are the two. You perpetrate some type of fraud through misrepresentation. You use the mail in the case of mail fraud, or you use a computer or a phone or electronic device with wire fraud. The case is very simple, and that is she had advertised and hyped that through a single blood stick on your finger, you could do a complete blood panel, and it turned out not to work. But where the case is going to boil down, absolutely the key to the whole case is nobody's going to contend that she sat down on day one saying she knew it would never work. The point is she wanted to do this technology, but the prosecution theory is there came a point in time when she knew it didn't work, yet she kept telling investors and patients that it did, and that's the fraud. As far as the 20 years, that's the statutory maximum. It's 0 to 20 years. We have U.S. sentencing guidelines, and they would come out, less than that, but that's a separate seminar.
Right. Now, the big news is she's expected to testify, and that is said to be a very risky strategy. Why?
Taking the stand in a white-collar, federal trial is very, very risky for a fundamental sort of psychiatric reason, and that is that jurors are too skeptical. Honestly, I have to be honest, having been in the trenches of these rodeos for 36 years, they sort of automatically want to disbelieve the person. That's really why it's so risky, less than the cliche of the hard cross-examination.
Now, we know that she's pleaded innocent, and we've discovered that she's probably going to blame her co-defendant, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. What can you tell us about their relationship, and what is it about their relationship that is supposed to make her less culpable?
Well, they had a long-standing relationship, at Theranos, working together, but they also had a romantic involvement, which they kept secret from the other people at the company, by the way. And the point is, now that everything has, fractured, don't forget, he was charged as well. He got what we call a severance, which in simple English is a separate trial next year. They felt that there was too much spillover prejudice. As far as blaming him, that's more of a, psychiatric expert question than for me. But I'll give you my quick take very quickly, which is that if it were a one-time sort of crime, a short-term thing, it would have a better chance of success than conduct that went on over a longer period of time. My crystal ball prediction, I'm telling you right now, is she is not going to go with that in court. And I felt that they may have put it out simply beforehand to make people think about it. But I don't think she's going to go with that.
Yeah, the famous Wall Street journalist John Carreyrou, the one who exposed this entire scam, has said, it's unlikely to work because everyone knows that Elizabeth Holmes, when it came right down to it, was calling the shots. Is that right?
There's no question about it. I mean, it's a very risky gambit, and it's a very risky proposition. It's just not going to work because on her best day, the two of them were co-equally running everything, discussing everything. They were very, very close, spent, hours and hours and hours together. So, as a trial lawyer, I can tell you that it'd be pretty easy to develop the argument. Do you really think that it was his influence that caused her to do this?
Yeah.
Again, I just don't think she's going to go with that.
Doug, a final question for you for now. She had a baby this year. I'm not saying it was a ploy necessarily for a more lenient sentence, but she knew she was going to trial. Does having a baby affect the judge's sentencing? Should she be found guilty?
That's a great question. I mean, I've sat in courtroom after courtroom for years where people bring, infants and babies and family members, and they try to, garner some type of sympathy from the court. As a general proposition, it doesn't really get you a whole lot of sympathy. I can't, speak to whether she did that specifically because of the case. But again, I think it's a non-entity issue, essentially.
OK. Joseph, turning to you now. The unraveling of Elizabeth Holmes began with one of her employees contacting your family, which put him in touch with John Carreyrou, as I say, the journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Just tell us about how that happened.
Yeah, I mean, that gentleman is identified as Alan Beam in John Carreyrou's book, and he was a former medical director at Theranos. He was in the process of leaving the company in frustration because he was essentially being asked to participate in fraudulent blood tests. And he was being threatened by Theranos, like so many others, and their law firm. And so he, at that period, he reached out to us, having identified us as also been on the receiving end of threats from that company, and that ultimately led to us connecting him with John Carreyrou, and was foundation for getting that series of articles in the journal started.
Now, the article came out in 2015. The book, Bad Blood, which really exposed so many of the details around this case, came out in 2018. And Theranos was wound up, dissolved, if you like, in the same year. How did you feel once the story had come out and Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were pretty much finished?
Well, I ambivalent. I mean, I'm happy to see the truth, the truth come out. I think that that's vindicating in some respects. But there's an element of frustration too, in that Elizabeth continues to involve people in her vortex. There are dozens of people who are going to go have to testify in this trial. who have lives they'd like to be leading. Lots of resource being wasted on this trial, which I think is as farcical as her diagnostic box. So there's part of me that's frustrated with her ongoing conduct, but I'm happy it's been exposed.
Yeah, I mean, your family had known her family and had ended up in a rather rough legal battle, a confrontation with her. Just tell us about that and what you discovered about her, and what that might mean for the case going forward, how she might act in her own case, in her own defense.
Well, look, it's interesting. When that case settled, it was settled by her attorney at the time, David Boyce, and I'm told on good authority, settled against her wishes. Elizabeth Holmes is not an easy client. She's not someone to take advice. She is, I think, imprudently marching towards a very bad sentence. A more rational person would have taken a plea and moved on with their life. She isn't incapable of self-reflection and taking a step back, and I'm afraid it's going to bite her here.
Yeah. As I mentioned at the beginning, you're a medical inventor yourself. How much harm has she done to that sector?
Well, look, I mean, like any profession, you have regulators, but the real insurance of quality is professional standards, and that's true in almost any field, whether it's engineering, making pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and even to some extent the law. What she did is fundamentally outrageous. I mean, she had tests that she could not validate, that she knew didn't work. She launched them anyway. She actually marketed them to children, and I think most heinously marketed them to autistic children.
Yeah.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. You know what? As we've been discussing, Elizabeth Holmes managed to con a lot of rich and powerful people and the financial press, even though she was very young and had no track record really to speak of. But how? Well, as the old saying goes, it's not what you know, but who you know. Elizabeth Holmes gave a masterclass in networking, which would have put LinkedIn to shame. Dropping out of Stanford at 19, her first step was to use her illustrious family's connections. Her first big backer was former neighbor and venture capitalist Tim Draper, who invested $1 million. A friend of her dad's introduced her to another venture capitalist, Don Lucas, who hooked her up with Oracle founder Larry Ellison. Big break there, he put in $100 million, and with his seal of approval, all the doors were open. Holmes was granted a meeting with former Secretary of State George Shultz, who joined her board, and he opened the door to other conservative elder statesmen, including another former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Momentum built, and at the height of the Theranos hype, General James Mattis and former Navy Admiral Gary Roughhead climbed on board. So too did successful businessmen, including the former CEO of Wells Fargo. As she built an illustrious board, she continued to draw in big investors. The Walton family, founders of Walmart, put up $150 million. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch stumped up $125 million. The DeVos family, as in Trump's education secretary Betsy DeVos, sunk $100 million into the Theranos vision. All in all, investors, some of the most successful, accomplished, and richest people around, parted with about $900 million, leaving them wondering, what just happened? Let's go to Hirsch now for a bit of analysis on that. All the commentary suggests that she managed to leapfrog from one rich older man to another and managed to sort of use each of their reputations to lure the next guy in, and also what's called FOMO, the fear of missing out. Tell us how she did it.
Well, she basically did it by beginning with a venture capitalist, extremely well known, who in fact had faith in her at a time before it was known whether the technology would work or not. So all of that was quite legit. The way that venture capital communities and investment communities work for startup firms is that there's a great deal of trust. That if someone you trust thinks that there's a good idea to be funded and invites you to be part of the action, then there's a motive to actually participate. And so while there's a lack of evidence that there's a problem, it's like joining a party and participating, bringing in others along the way. Trust is really critical. Essentially, there are 4 key components to trust. One is benevolence, that you think you're dealing with friends rather than foes. There's a sense of integrity, that you can trust the people you're working with. There's a sense of competence, that the people that you're working with know what they're doing. And finally, there's a sense of predictability, that you can sort of predict that one thing will work from situation to situation. So all these folks trust each other. And once you begin with one and they know each other and have worked with each other in the past, they will naturally come on board. Sure. Now, fear of missing out is really fundamental and critical, both to the venture capital community, but also to Elizabeth Holmes herself. The people we know who set high aspirations, so success is defined by choosing a goal that's really high, and for whom achieving success is incredibly important, will be inclined to comfortably take on high risk. And that was the case here. Because we're social animals, the goals have to do with not missing out. We want to be part of the action. And so everybody in this situation winds up being a risk taker, hoping against hope when the risks are imprudent that it'll all work out well in the end.
Right. And with Silicon Valley, there's something quite special because people expect it to be a gold mine. And then you've got, as John Carreyrou put it in a recent article, there is a myth that survives to this day, popularized by the incredible success of Steve Jobs, that Silicon Valley every few years can produce these young genius startup founders and they can do no wrong. I mean, that is something that carries on to this day, Hirsch.
The first half is actually, I think, reasonable. So Silicon Valley has created more large, successful companies than any place else in the world, 25 times as many as Europe. So the track record is good. It's the second half, do no wrong, I think, that's the stuff of mythology. So there are 2 types of risks. One is that some idea simply won't work out. And the other is that fraud won't be perpetrated. And it's the second half that we learned through the case of Theranos, that we're just subject to fraud as any place else.
But there's another component to this, isn't there, Hirsch, which is the idea of a woman breaking into the Silicon Valley, sort of breaking the Silicon Valley glass ceiling. Here's John Carreyrou again. He said a lot of people wanted to believe this fairy tale because it would have represented real progress in this very male-dominated world of Silicon Valley. Unfortunately, it was a fairy tale that wasn't true. Do you think Elizabeth Holmes, being a woman, did make a difference to her scheming and her credibility?
Yes, I think that it did. I think that John Carreyrou was right on that. It's something that we want to have happen. We want to break the glass ceiling. We want it to be a fairer world. And she promised us the potential for that happening. She was giving us evidence that was happening. She allowed us to engage in wishful thinking, that wishing would make it so. And so she capitalized on it, and it created a lot of disappointment for a lot of people. But now, what it did do was it made us look the other way. It made us not be diligent. And I think, that is part of the tragedy of the Theranos story.
Now, a couple of the Theranos employees have given us an insight into what it was like working there, and clearly they're extremely disappointed and hurt by the entire saga. Here's one. You not only conned your investors, you conned us too. You had us believing in your mission and trusting your iron fist rule. Another said, from day one, an unnerving feeling. I joined a cult like an observer, not yet brainwashed, that only escalated in sinister intensity until my last day. Hirsch, do you think the way they describe it, a cult, is an appropriate term?
A cult is an appropriate term for, I think, what took place at Theranos. So you believe in your leader, you believe in the direction, you believe in their vision, and you believe that they have the tenacity to take you through all the problems and reach that rainbow at the end, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So I think that that was the case for many of them, but not for all of them. That's why you had whistleblowers within the firm itself. So I think that many of the Theranos employees did drink the Kool-Aid and were part of the cult, and a few brave ones, were willing to tell a different story, to tell the truth.
Joseph, we heard earlier how Elizabeth Holmes came from an illustrious family. I just wonder if that drove her to be a success at any cost. I just want to quote her father talking about their family lineage. I have personally known 4 generations of Fleischmans. I find them on balance to be creative, artistic, eccentric, funny, driven and restless. They tend to do very interesting things. Do you think that she felt it was her destiny to restore her family's fortunes?
There's no question in my mind. This is a big part of the pathology and story of Elizabeth Holmes, is restoring the paradise lost of the Fleischmann fortune. She grew up very much in the milieu of a family focused on what they had lost generationally or been reduced to in their perception.
Doug, there's lots of speculation that if she's found guilty, it will mean that tech entrepreneurs and people investing and so on will have to behave more cautiously and more prudently. But if she's found innocent, then it will create a sort of a Wild West atmosphere, and people want to push it even harder in terms of overstating the claims of their company. Do you think that makes sense?
Well, it's a good encapsulation of what we call deterrence, pro and con deterrence in a case. I mean, one of the things in any high-profile case, tax cases around tax filing time, things like that, is, you hit it on the head. If she's found guilty, people are going to, think twice in terms of, I thought it was an interesting explanation of the investor culture from Hirsch, and I agree. The point is people want to believe in it. They get caught up in the hype and so on. So to your point, if she's found guilty, there'll be a little bit of a, throttling back. And if she's found not guilty, it could lead to a little more brazen conduct. Again, that's why people watch these high-profile white-collar cases.
Hirsch, human nature being what it is, this kind of thing is bound to happen again. In fact, last week, the founder of an app testing startup called Headspin was arrested on charges of wire fraud. Manish Lakwani is accused of making up nearly $60 million in sales using fake invoices and altered financial records to convince investors to plow $100 million into the company. Again, you see investors, Hirsch, there reportedly piling in without really examining it closely because of fear of missing out.
Yes, history repeats itself. So I think that in this particular case, it was a junior version of Theranos, about 1/10 the size, but the exact same dynamic at work. So you had investors who believed in the story, and you had a CEO who fed them what they wanted to hear. And so that continued for quite a while until the board, I think belatedly, finally dug into the numbers and discovered that what they were being told was not quite the way it was.
Right. Well, he's going to fight it, no doubt. If everybody wants to get the next big thing coming along, because, it's easy money. You put a little in, you get a heck of a lot out, and you also look really smart in front of your friends. But how do you rationalize it? What sort of steps should you take as an investor to make sure you're not caught up in what Alan Greenspan would call irrational exuberance?
Yes, so that's not so easy. But the thing to do is you have to go in with a clear-eyed sense that something might be wrong. It's probably a good idea to ask yourself, if you heard in the end that this was going to be a disaster, how would you imagine that the disaster would play out? And so if you just begin by asking yourself that question and engaging in that imaginative exercise, it will help set your mind to think about being on guard. Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. And I think that's the mindset that is important, not just for nuclear talks, but for engaging in investments, that you certainly want to trust and you certainly want to hope, but you don't want to trust completely. And verifying is sort of the key. Being on the lookout for what might go wrong.
Well, opening arguments begin on September the 8th. Certainly a date for the diary. We may get a chance to bring you all back till then, though. Thank you to all three of you. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week, then, goodbye.